welcome to our new podcast and digital health of the record focus. So, as always, we're going to focus on the latest technologies, clinical trends, and news and give you unfiltered insights. And my name is Edwin Cohen from CM and I'm hosting this together with.
And I'm Farrell Healion from OptiTrial. And today we're going to take a bit more of a look into the patient centricity side and looking at what impact incorporating patient voice as part of your study design can have on your ability to recruit and retain your patients as part of your trial, because I think that is an absolute necessity because there is a lot of interesting data out there. I think there's a very strong data point in the industry that only about 80% of studies actually recruit to target. And it gets even more crazy from there, that only about 2 to 5% of eligible patients participate in clinical trials, which is per some research from Cutsy and Cutsy and ISPEP, which just shows that, you know, the very tip of the iceberg is what actually gets into studies themselves. And if we're not even hitting recruitment targets based on that, we need to do something else to try and expand that pool.
Yeah, can I just add to that, Farrell? I think, we chose this topic for a reason, because I think, first of all, doing clinical trials and designing new and bringing new medicines to the market is all for patients. So it would be strange if we wouldn't put these patients in the center of everything. And it's what I think is interesting is that it's been a topic for quite some time, like many of the other topics that we've been addressing. But apparently, it's a topic that needs to be addressed all the time because the patients who are, or the people who are really close to the patient centricity work that's being done still feel that they are sort of either undermined or that it's sort of slipping away throughout the year. So there's a lot of people who are still required to be very vocal in the patient centricity part here. The recent conference that I attended, there was space for patient centricity, and I believe that you're supporting on another conference this particular topic as well. So I think for us, recapping and sort of advocating for this topic is apparently needed. Otherwise, it's going to be buried somewhere in the big other sort of priorities from companies.
Exactly, and they are at the center, and at the same time, you know, the patients that do participate are doing so on a volunteer basis. So, you know, the skin in the game for them is, you know, their time and effort. They're the ones that are really investing in this study as well as the sponsors. So it is paramount to making sure that, you know, we're doing anything we can to help ease or make it meaningful to them, probably more so along the way. So maybe a question, Edwin. So, you know, what are the reasons, or what's the why behind incorporating that patient voice as part of your study design and making sure you're including it as early as possible? Because I know from experience, and I'm sure you do too, when you have to firefight, because when you get into study conduct and you need to start rescuing things, it has a lot more impact, time and effort, and cost ultimately when it comes to trying to, you know, hit any targets that you're trying to achieve with your study.
Yeah, and I would say there are quite a lot of reasons why we are doing this and need to continue to focus on patient centricity. And as I said in my introduction, it's we are developing drugs for patients to get it to the market. So it's all about the patient. So going to repeat this. We are doing this for patients. So it would make sense to have them involved in study design and in clinical trials. But yeah, if I can give an example, is like if we bring them earlier into the development stage, even when protocols are being designed, you can fetch all the small things that are impacting patients once they're in the trial. And this is links back to what you said. It eventually reduces the number of, or potentially, because not all amendments are related to patient burden, but yes, there will be a lot less protocol deviation, for example, if you create better protocols, and patients' input are, I would say, key on this.
Absolutely, because when you are creating your target product profile, ultimately, it's a bunch of scientists and people in a room who may or may not have any real lived experience. So when you are creating your new medication, it just seems naturally obvious to me that you should really be focusing on the other TPP as part of that, which is your target patient population. So thinking about what of the disease that they have is most impactful, and what is going to make them choose your medication ultimately. So it's when you have a COPD patient, it's not lung capacity or anything like that that's going to be important to them. It's not running out of breath as they go up one flight of stairs is the more practical side of it. So there's a lot of things that you have to consider of that real world element, like you said.
Mapping out the patient journey for each target therapeutic area or disease area and your specific clinical study is extremely relevant. And it's not a thing that has been done for a long time. I've seen this happening, but not consistently. And I think that's where sort of the industry can improve, to have this embedded in the development for every study, because exactly that patient journey shows where there's a gap compared to sort of your assessment schedule and how you describe the assessments to be done. Another thing that I wanted to mention or call out is that the better you design your study and the better you explain what is going to be expected from a patient in the clinical study, it's very likely that you will have less dropouts. And the number of dropouts in the study, so patients either discontinuing either from study drugs or completely withdrawing consent, is still an issue. You need to recruit more patients eventually, which is definitely not a good thing. But it's really about managing the expectation, and you can't do this better by having early input from patients themselves.
Exactly. I think maybe another side of it as well, which tying into that kind of education piece that you're mentioning, there's also that need to remember that these aren't just patients, they are also people. And that's, figuring out how do you be flexible with, the more operational elements, like you said. So your schedule of activities and anything that you do need the patient to do, how can you be more flexible to make sure that you're able to be human about it? So how do you fit around their life? Do they need to travel constantly to go to the hospital to perform any assessments, or depending on where they are in life as well, do they have young kids or work, and are they going to have to take time off, schedule babysitters, or if they're old or very ill, do they need a caregiver to go with them to help support them with traveling around and so on? So there is a lot of reasons why you would not participate. So it's how do you break those down to make sure that you are able to support the people as part of the journey, because they're going to have to manage a lot of emotional burden as well. They're sick, then there's all this new uncertainty when they're participating compared to their standard of care. So it's how do you make them feel most comfortable?
Yeah, I agree. I would say last but not definitely not least in why we need to do this is I think it's regulations and guidelines who are now a little bit more focusing on explicitly mentioning that patient centricity is an important thing. Personally, I don't think we should be doing this because someone else is saying so, but it should be a more natural thing. But it does help to have it embedded in the guidelines.
Nice.
Yeah.
So
Are you also able to give any? Let's take a deeper dive. Let me put it this way, and to give examples on what exactly is being done. We talked a little bit of, we already sort of touched upon these kind of things a little bit, but let's take a deeper dive into sort of what exactly is being done to become more patient centric.
yeah, and I think honestly, it all starts with just being very conscious and intentional when it comes to designing your study. So I don't know how many times that people just copy and paste things from a previous study, especially if it's part of a program, without really considering what the impact and burden might be. So, there's one example that I heard of for a hypertension study where basically they copy and pasted from the old study, but they wanted to recruit within a black demographic. But the inclusion exclusion criteria was, based upon generally a white population that was previously recruited. And and I think that kind of sums things up because ultimately, depending how strict your criteria is, you may be cutting off even more of that patient population, which is crazy because there was an article in the New England Journal of Medicine which showed that where you have strict inclusion criteria, you may end up with only 48% of patients being eligible. And going back to the first data point, if only 2 to 5% of participants will join a trial, you're down to 1%, which just means that, or less than 1% of the patient population, which is just really cutting off your hand. And also, just want to make a point as well that, diversity isn't dead. In science, it is driven from physiological things. It is science. It's not, some kind of political stance. It is about treating humans and all the differences between humans. So it is an important aspect to consider as part of your inclusion exclusion criteria and study design.
Yeah. Any other examples?
So I think other cases of what is being done, there's, cases like the study participant feedback questionnaire that gets incorporated in studies now, which gets during the study, it focuses on, getting that patient feedback on what their experience has been and helps understand how participation has been for them. So if you're part of a program, you can take that feedback, feed it into your next study, or you can also, adapt your trial as it's ongoing, make some amendments
Yeah.
along the way so that you can improve the experience for your patients.
Yeah.
So whether that's, you start removing some of the, let's call them excessive activities that are just burden adding and not really any value,
Yeah.
which could enable greater decentralization, then, that can help patients no end if it helps to reduce some of their travel and time burden as part of their participation,
Yeah.
being more flexible.
Yeah, indeed. The SPFQ, though, if I'm correct, it's a questionnaire developed via Translerato initially, which
Yes,
is the cross-industry uh,
exactly.
initiative. I'm calling it an initiative, which which I think is really great. I think I'm all for standardization. I think this is really patient focused. Um, do not have the latest data around how many companies are actually using this because it's eventually up to the member companies who want to, to say whether they are going to use this. Um, but yeah, I've seen that this is being used initially on paper. The good thing about sort of the technology nowadays, and if you're already using DCT capabilities or a device or whatsoever, you can surface these questionnaires through the devices even. So that's really a good thing. So just to add on for the people who are not aware about the questionnaire itself, but I think, as said, it's really good that it's a cross-industry accepted questionnaire.
Exactly, and that's how the industry can come together and focus an effort on how to make this possible, because ultimately, with such a big and politically charged sometimes industry, it's important to work together to try and drive overall improvements rather than the feeling of just being a drop in the ocean, and then maybe it doesn't make any major change within for patients as part of the trials. And any other things that you've seen as part of
obviously we are focusing with our podcast on digital health. So we talked about DCT capabilities before, and one of the big arguments to utilize DCT was because it's being patient-centric. I'm still advocating for this. However, you need to still carefully look into what type of technology you will utilize in your study. Otherwise, it will backfire. Just adding tools, we know this though, just adding tools, adding more wearables, or asking to or defining more remote data is not going to be patient-centric per se.
Yeah, you don't want to turn patients into RoboCop where they've got like every single like piece of kit hanging off of them as part of
yeah, you never know what the future will bring, but as long as it's not that burdensome, then I think we're doing the right thing. But yeah, obviously DCT is patient should be patient-centric, and doing like virtual visits or video visits and these type of capabilities is a very simple thing. Like, we are having this podcast remotely in a virtual setting, so you don't need to be in one room to record a podcast. So for patients, and doing just a checkup is something that's already out there in a really easy way. I consider that to be one of the features as part of a DCT capability. And yes, you can have a lot more, but yeah, definitely. A little bit more old school though, as sort of what's being done is creating a sort of patient materials and thank you cards. And thank you cards is really at the closure of the study, but the patient materials is sort of an addition to the informed consent. It's to explain in a different way with animations or graphical content about what the patient is going to expect, how certain procedures look like, and so forth. And again, I, in all honesty, I believe that the consent form should be this simple, but I also understand that it's not always easy to write it and explain all the different type of assessments in this specific way. So these materials are really adding and are perceived very well by the participants. So something that we will definitely need to continue. And then the patient cards to close with is, we know that patients, they volunteer for this, and everyone likes to be sort of get a compliment or these kind of things. And a thank you card is maybe a simple way to uh, formalize this and say really thank you for participating, and that helps in sort of even making them decide to participate in a new follow-up type of study. But it at least keeps them engaged. So it's not only at the end, but also interimly keeping them up to date about study progress and these kind of things. That's seriously something that patients value.
Exactly, and I think we should go beyond that even, because I think always, from what I've heard or seen, is if you do have your thank you card, and that's it, right? There is no further updates getting out to the patients for the time they've put in, like telling them where the study's at or how it's progressed, or what has been the result. So how do you keep them in the loop of what their contribution mattered? So they should be part of hearing, that you've got approval or the data has looked amazing or whatever it might be, just to really show them that, their contribution mattered, beyond,
Yeah.
that good feeling. I think another example of things that has changed a lot is that there's a lot of sponsors now have like patient engagement leads, which really interact with those patient communities, engaging with patient advocacy groups, or, working with people in that target population to really get their feedback, or, make sure that they're incorporating what's important to them, so that it's really focused on how to treat the patient and not just treat the condition.
And this
So I
is
think
more, it's not so much specifically focused on one protocol, but more program level, though.
exactly.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It's looking more at, the disease itself and what living with that disease means in reality, beyond, the scientific bits on paper, right? So the
Yeah.
human elements of it.
Yeah, indeed.
So, I mean, all of that sounds great and amazing, and why wouldn't we be doing this? So, yeah, any examples of why are we maybe not totally successful in making sure we're doing all of this at the moment?
Yeah, yeah. This is interesting. I think purely because I think if you ask everyone, we all want to do things for patients, but it's the day to day maybe, and sort of living towards each sort of milestone in your own scorecard even are driving you a little bit away from these things, because they are time consuming, or they could be time consuming, because you need to gather the data, sit down with the patient group, trying to translate that all back into protocols. So yeah, time. And I wouldn't say the money here is an issue. I don't normally, I would bring in money as a concern, but I don't think that's really the case. But it's really the time to gather all of that information. I would say that's my first and most important example.
Yeah, and I think, going a bit controversial or spicy here, but it's always the case that there's always that big rush to hitting, the first patient in milestone, when ultimately your critical path isn't first patient in, it's last patient, last visit. So why are we rushing to set up something that ultimately, to make sure that you're able to deliver your trial, you may end up already accepting that you're going to have to include a protocol amendment down the line. So it's that case of, you don't have enough time to do it right once, but you have enough time to do it twice,
Yeah.
thrice, however many times you need to make sure that you're able to recruit correctly,
Yeah.
which is always fun.
Yeah, yeah. I would sort of like to add to sort of the previous thing that I mentioned is, and to what you said, there are companies now who have patient engagement leads who support all of this, and what I believe is really important is that in your development and the governance around it, you really have this embedded, and that allows you to eventually also reuse all the data that you've collected. As said, I've seen these exercises sitting down with patient groups, getting the feedback, and if you hear at the conference what they prefer to have in protocols and what we need to think about, I don't believe that message has changed a lot. But what I think is interesting is that we haven't learned and haven't done really the things that are consistently coming back to us as feedback. So we need to, so maybe this is controversial. Maybe we don't need to have in future studies a lot of new patient insights, because the patient's insights are maybe not that new. We just need to ensure that we centralize the data that we've gathered and truly have that embedded in the new designs.
And I think a lot of, well, it depends. It's that kind of balance of, where something is not for profit or if it's a commercial offering, which you would hope a lot of these patient insights and advocacy pieces are not for profit, so it should be more distributable. But that's where the challenge, if a sponsor is commercially paying to do some research, are they going to be willing to share that far and wide? So it is that balancing act of how do you, I suppose, make sure that you're doing good and sharing what is worth sharing for the betterment of society, because ultimately, like you said at the start, that's why we're doing this.
Yeah, indeed. To close my sort of why it's not done, but it's not so particularly sort of why it's not done, but sort of what I don't believe in. I eventually do not believe that we can tailor the clinical studies towards each individual patient, because we're recruiting across the globe between 250 up to like 20,000 people. You cannot tailor a study towards 1,500 different type of participants. You can't. So, and this is all in the nature of doing clinical trials. You need to standardize things. And one thing I've learned, one size you've got one size fits all, but one size fits nobody. So you always encounter things that are not fit for purpose, but you need to get the balance right. You need to do all the best you can in order to make it as easy and centric as possible with the limitations that are out there.
Absolutely, because that's one thing for certain. You're never going to please everybody. So as long as you're taking an approach like, I don't know, Pareto or whatever, where you're doing like an 80-20 split, you should be in a very solid place as a starting point too.
Yeah, definitely. Any final key takeaways before we close this session, Farrell?
No, I think that's probably hit the nail on the head, that basically, it is important, and we need to, everybody is individual, so you're not going to be able to have a perfect study, but focus on how to have a very strong good enough, and then that should be more than good to fit your needs. And I think that can bring us to a wrap. So thank you for joining us today. This has been Digital Health Off the Record. And make sure that you're keeping engaged. Let us know if there's anything you want to hear from in the future. And make sure that you're liking, sharing, commenting. Let us know how is it for you.
Yes, thank you very much for listening, and we're looking forward to the next recording. And Farrell said, sign up, follow, and especially share your thoughts of new topics that we can address. So, see you next time.
Thanks. Bye.